The dog is not bad. What? Sure. I will. On the review. On the review video. Of course, I'll be happy to.
It takes me about 4 hours to listen.
Uh, it's where do you get older? Miss everything. My brother-in-law, I showed you his picture, 80 on the 16th. And he shoots his age on the golf course. It's awful. All right, we're going. We're getting back to, we're doing blood. So you remember we did all.
So this isn't on the exam.
This is not, if anything, this is lab related, but no, I'm not going to put this on the exam. Okay, so now we're going to talk. The next real stop about this is when we're going to start to look at, and we probably covered a little bit of it, but the interesting erythrocyte red blood cell, which are by far and away, not even close, the most abundant cell that's there. And again, what you're going to see when you see the developmental process. And again, the context of this is a lot of people suffer problems, particularly with insufficient amount of red blood cells. So these are filled with hemoglobin for gas transport. In the respiratory chapter, we look more at that curve, which I'm sure you've already looked at, with like Selim-Malek based, that hemoglobin saturation curve. Okay. And the remarkable thing, having this protein so they can bend and squeeze. And as I said to you before, a lot of the agents that we're using today, because they're less harsh and have less side effects for dealing with people with typical problems are clotting too much rather than not clotting enough. So structure and function, biconcave disc, okay, with the absence of the nucleus, 97% hemoglobin, great for the ATP productions. So this is what it looks like. The reversible binding with oxygen. That's the interesting thing about that. So you're all familiar, I know, and we'll review it again, with the hemoglobin molecule itself. So we're going to look at the hemoglobin molecule. We're going to look at how many there actually are. And it gives you some context as to just how dependent upon oxygen we are with the amount of volume that are there. If you think of it, we have about 5.5 million red blood cells in a milliliter of our blood. Those red blood cells have approximately 1 billion, each cell, 1 billion hemoglobin units that are there. I beg your pardon, the ability to carry about 1 billion oxygen molecules. And we circulate our blood constantly. Can you imagine the immense amount of oxygen that's required literally for us to do business? And if you want to do the math, you can do the math. So these are the numbers. As I said to you, for me, I'm down around 13. I've spent a lot of time under 13 like this. With women, it's a little less for the reasons we talked about, particularly for those during the menstruation years and because of the relative limited amount of testosterone or testosterone-like substances that are present. So we have heme and globin, how it gets its name, and you're all familiar. 2 alphas, 2 betas are the polypeptide chains. The heme is this sort of interesting protein iron molecule, and certainly the iron is the portion that imparts the red color, and the central iron binds one oxygen. There's that famous looking molecule that you've seen before that are there. So none of these questions are going to be about the structure, other than, it's got 2 alphas and 2 betas and 4 heme units in there. There you can see this sort of organometallic compound, I guess would be the proper way to describe that particular. And what's interesting about that is that's the unit that we have a certain degree of problems with from a disposal standpoint. So this is also the chapter where we look at, the formation of and the elimination of bilirubin or the heme breakdown products that are there. And Dan himself is interesting, obviously, that the nidus, the core, is is ferrous as opposed to ferric. Love that. Chemistry major stuff. Ferris wheel. Oh, just each red cell, 250 million hemoglobin molecules. Loading in the lungs. produces oxyhemoglobin, the oxygenated hemoglobin. The first item to understand is, with regard to the utilization curve, is when venous blood basically has lost about 25%. So we have a lot of residual oxygen typically, which is useful in instances where effectively blood flow has stopped, even transiently. So it's not as though all of a sudden magically there's no oxygen. And a lot of people, it's venous blood, doesn't have any oxygen, not true. So when it's unloading in the tissues, we have a certain percentage of deoxy or reduced hemoglobin. The color obviously changes. I commented on that before. People who deal a lot with blood, whether on a technologist level or a hematologist level, when you look at the blood, it gives you certain clues. In emergency, we always could tell the difference between arterial and venous blood and things like that. And 20% of carbon dioxide in blood binds to hemoglobin for the carbaminohemoglobin. The first area of misunderstanding is and a lot of students were taught this in elementary. I don't know how thorough they were with it. For those of you, maybe you took AP Bio or if you touched on this in high school, it was like what we were taught. The oxygen's riding on the hemoglobin and in the tissues, the oxygen jumps off and the carbon dioxide jumps on. Then, does some of it jump on? Yeah, the oxygen's on the heme unit. The carbon dioxide, that 20% limited, basically is more adherent to the globin portion of the chain. There's a small percentage, less than 10%, that becomes dissolved carbon dioxide gas, as many gases do. They'll dissolve in the solution, okay? And then, but most of it undergoes that famous change between water and carbon dioxide and forms carbonic acid, so it's a buffer. I mean, maybe 70%, goodly amount. So we talk about the formation of all the blood cells, generically hematopoiesis, okay? In the red bone marrow, reticular connective tissue. Remember, for those with anatomy, if you remember, the reticular connective tissue is like a strainer, like a sieve. And that we don't see it in that many places. We see it in lymph nodes where it sifts through the lymph. And basically, as it sifts its way through, it identifies microorganisms. Things have to be reacted to it in a lymph node basis. And it sifts through these it's almost like these are mega cells. As they sift through, they separate, and even platelets to some extent fragment off, as you will see through this idea of the reticular. So there's sinusoidal capillaries. Other than that, you only see them in the liver. In the adult, axial skeleton, shoulder and hip areas, proximal epiphyses, therefore, of the humerus and femur, as well as some in the scapula, perhaps a bit more in the os coxae, in the hip bone assembly. And that's where we gather bone marrow for analysis, either from iliac crest, because it's easy access, or from sternum. Think of the areas where the bone is, relatively speaking, subcutaneous. There's not a whole lot of connective tissue or fatty tissue between your breastbone and your skin. It's very easy access. And for a lot of people, depending on how heavy you are, how much extra weight that you have, you can basically access the iliac crest. That's where you get bone marrow to either analyze, and really, as we move on, the critical test for identifying abnormalities in the bloodstream, very simply, bone marrow aspiration. Blood tests are useful, chemical tests are useful, clinical evaluation is useful. Bone marrow aspiration is the gold standard. And now we have a technology that's been around for, 40 or so years, which is bone marrow implantation or bone marrow transplants. So, I mean, it's changed a lot over time, that we have the ability now to effectively, quote unquote, sterilize the bone marrow, basically eliminating it and being able to transplant new bone marrow for everything from leukemia, sickle cell anemia, other types of blood dyscrasias. It's a big deal. It's not necessarily an easy or an always successful procedure. The hematopoietic stem cells are called hemocytoblasts. They give rise white cells, red cells, platelets. lots of different things cause them to go on a particular pathway. Once they commit to a pathway, and you're going to see, because we're going to do this in the lab. Again, we're not going to do it this week because we'll do the wet lab part next week. You're going to look at, like we did in the old days, whether the white blood cells basically are two lines. They're called granulocytes because you can see granules when they're stained, or agranulocytes where you have granules, just can't see them. And in the old days, we were just looking at a microscope and count the first 100 we would see, and have like a little thing. Like years ago, when you went to the penny arcade, it was penny arcade. You had the guy, they'd make change when you went to like the amusement park, and they had the thing, you give him $1 and nickels, dimes, quarters. That's kind of the counter that you have. It's all right. I was talking with my best friend last night. We're both going to hit 72 this year. His students, where he was teaching, didn't know it, couldn't relate to my cultural examples or his. So you're excused. As I said to him, Mel Brooks hasn't made a movie in a long time. Peter Schwartz, be with you. Okay, so they go into these sinusoidal areas. So the formation of red cells, we're going to start with that, about 15 days, not a big deal. Transformed into a myeloid, and you don't have to know these. The myeloid stem cell transforms into a pro-erythro-red blast. Is a blast by definition are immature cells. Okay, and then as you can see, many ribosomes stain blue, so we call them basophilic, etc., polychromatic, orthochromatic, mostly hemoglobin, pink. Most of the organelles are already starting to eject, nucleus degrading, seeing the shape. And now, years ago, this number 6 was something called a normoblast, Normo. And when you saw I'll give you the frame the way an oncologist, hematologist who taught us, bless you, during our residency said, this is one thing when you do a blood test and you're doing a blood count, you look for immature forms. If there's immature forms, either they're being made too fast or there's something that's occupying the space and they're pushing them out too fast. Okay? If they're overly mature, then the process is too slow. So you look for things that are irregular. And normal blasts these were not something you typically saw. Reticulocytes, and this is an important note for categorizing different kinds of anemia. For those of you who go in clinical fields, there's about 1% of all your red cells are called reticulocytes. We see little amounts of reticulum and ribosomes. That's how they derive their name. That's an important measure. If the number is very high, pushed out too fast. If the number is very low, pushed out too slowly. That's what it's my favorite. Not enough, too much, just right. Remember? Too hot, too cold, just right. Goldilocks, bears.
Yeah.
Remember that? You know what I think of it when I hear about that? I think of one thing. Home invasion. She goes in there, she trashes the bear's house, sleeps in their bed, eats their food. Give me a break. She's just looking for trouble.
Amen. Preach it.
Yeah, I'm telling you. That's another one of those quote. Well, first of all, fairy tales are pejorative, and secondly, yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, you know what I'm saying.
I know exactly.
You know what I'm saying. How about Snow White with the dwarfs? She's
worse.
living with 7 dwarfs. Are you kidding me? One name's Doc. Give me a break. Who comes up with that? I remember when we talked that whatever that movie was with Ariel and Under the Sea when my kids were little.
Little Mermaid.
Yeah, it's scary.
Oh my God, that's my favorite Disney movie.
It's a great movie.
You don't wish I could be part of your world.
That too.
Yeah, you should sing that.
No thanks.
You'd be a great Sebastian.
Okay.
Like sha-la-la-la-la-my-oh-my. Yeah.
Well, I think if
That was beautiful. Jim.
I know.
maybe he should be.
Me, I can't sing.
I used to have a good singing voice. 40 years of cigarettes killed it. Okay, So mature erythrocytes in 2 days, the ribosomes degrade, mature RBC. The retic count is, these are important. Notice what's happening from the stem cell to when it commits, it's getting smaller. So an immature cell, in the sense of development, is a large cell. So when we see overly large cells, it's a problem. I didn't load it, but I'll do a screenshot of a series of my blood tests recently because I have them on my computer and I'll show them to you in lab. So you can see the difference. This is the quote unquote normal blast. You can see it's considerably larger with or without the nucleus. The retics, you can still see that, and that's the name, and then you see the mature RBC. If you don't have enough RBCs, you can't get enough oxygen. If you have too many RBCs, being the most abundant cell, it makes the blood overly thick. Okay, it increases the viscosity. The machinery inside is designed to move blood at a certain viscosity level. What happens if you put overly thick oil in your car? If you put the wrong grade in, it's going to, fornicate it up.
Oh yeah.
I wanted to be careful not to say any bad words. Okay, so 2 million RBCs are made per second. The balance, hormonal controls and dietary requirements. You're going to encounter in your own lives, or certainly if you go into any type of medically oriented field, people who have varying types of anemia, like the one who's talking to you. That's here. So it's based on erythropoietin, which we can make genetically. There's always a small amount to maintain basal rate. It's from the kidneys mostly, a little bit from the liver in response to low levels of oxygen. Pretty standard negative feedback loop. Okay? Kidney cells cannot degrade, hypoxia inducible factor, blah, 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 accumulates triggers. So they give you the pathway that's there. Not a big deal, just to understand negative feedback, low oxygen promotes the release of erythropoietin. Here are the different causes that are there. If you're not making enough or if you're losing some, either by hemorrhage or destruction. So that is an insufficient number of red cells, insufficient hemoglobin, and perhaps as common as any problem, iron deficiency anemia. So you can look at different ways that this occurs. So, and hemorrhage doesn't mean you have to visibly see someone bleeding. The reason I underwent all those transfusions, though these many years ago, more than 20, about 24 years ago, in 1998 to like 2000, was because I was bleeding internally constantly from an ulcer. So they pour, and it's very, very slow. And that's the distinction. Your body can adapt even to such a significant degree of adversities. But ladies and gentlemen, I will tell you, the fatigue was so great that the steps coming from the entry level to up here, I'd have to stop halfway. Easy. Okay. Just to give you an idea when it was very, very severe. Insufficient hemoglobin per, I should bring my daughter in here to tell you what it was like. Insufficient, reduced availability of oxygen. That's a different story. And so you're going to see sometimes that's normal. When you and I make the transition, if we are normally living here, I don't know if it's ever happened to you. My stepdaughter and her boyfriend live in Denver. We went out there we vacationed out there. Summer of 2020, the lockdown zone, up at Snowshoe, which is up, you're going up to almost 11,000, then coming down to about 8. I mean, I had a headache I can't even describe. And my wife didn't get it, but I got it. I mean, it's a gorgeous area, but that's just an example. That's something that occurs when you don't have enough time for some people with regard to a rapid change in altitude versus having some type of lung problem. Okay, so what happens if you have too many erythrocytes or high oxygen levels in blood? It will inhibit it. Okay, the erythropoietin causes erythrocytes to mature faster, and testosterone, that's mainly the principal reason. As I said before, along with menstruation, why men have a higher, not dramatically so, not disproportionately so. One of those things, can't stand them. So this was the source of, this was something they could trace genetically, even though it was a biological substance. EPO levels, and the one sport where this was abused more than any other was distance cycling. So that was not necessarily what Lance Armstrong and his team did, were auto transfusions. They would basically remove their blood, spin it down, save that blood, and inject themselves with high proportionate amounts of pack cells. So provide them with more oxygen carrying capability. I mean, understand that race in 3 weeks, you're doing up and down hills, and these are big ass hills. I love the race, 2,000 miles. He was a remarkable athlete anyway. It's just unfortunate, the cheating, because he was, I mean, the guy had testicular cancer that metastasized to his brain when he was a world-class cycler, and then came back and was even, I mean, it was just remarkable. And it's always been a sport that's been involved in it. So what's the big problem with doing it, other than the fact it's a form of performance enhancement? It increases the hematocrit to extraordinary levels, and that's the predisposition to clotting, strokes, heart attacks, whatever, heart failure from your heart trying to push this extraordinarily viscous material throughout the system. So it's very interesting with regard to that. So I think at the race, at the Tour de France and the other big races, they start to, that's another one on the bucket list. I want to go there, and the food's okay.
Where does it take place?
Well, it depends. They used to be all in France. They always will do mountains through the Pyrenees and through the Alps at different, they will do that. But nowadays they're starting at different countries around. They might start in Denmark or in Belgium. So they typically are starting there. They'll do certain coasts. They always end in Paris on the Champs-Élysées. Okay, so all the stuff you need to have: iron from your diet. 65% of iron is found in hemoglobin. Rest in these other areas. Free iron ions are toxic. So when they're stored in these iron protein compounds. This one's interesting, hemosiderin. So one of the things we see with hemosiderin deposition, certain people, if you see an older individual who's had phlebitis, which is a blood clot in their leg, one of the little tells, if it's phlebitis, particularly on the outside and in the superficial veins, they have very, very, and even deep phlebitis, depending on its impact on the superficial system, the blood will seep out from the backflow. There's so much back pressure. The blood seeps out into the tissue. The hemosiderin deposits in the skin. It's extraordinarily itchy. And what happens is people can't help, even if they're asleep, even if they cut their nails down to numbs, they're got their legs running together, and they're scratching, and it breaks down, and they cause a particular thing called a stasis ulceration, which I have a lot of experience treating. And they are nasty. So hemosiderin in the skin, it's like a black and blue mark. If you ever notice a big one that you got for some reason, sometimes they get kind of itchy as they're resolving. That's because you're getting transient amounts of hemosiderin in the skin. It's transported, as you can see, by transferrin, another protein-based carrier. On the assembly side, on the maturation side, these two guys, vitamin B12 and folic acid, which is also in the B vitamin category. Folic acid, they're both essential, okay, for normal blood formation. And folic acid is pivotal for the assembly of a variety of adenine, I think it's, of nucleotide bases that are there. So they're again, things that we have to acquire through diet. Folic acid historically was very interesting because before we used really good prenatal vitamins and people had the availability of vitamin supplements, there were a lot of neural tube disorders. They were due to folic acid. They had meningeal and myelomeningeal, where the neural tube didn't form in the spine. You had outpouchings. It was, it was tragic, or at the very least cause significant problems for children born that way. So they were able to, bless you, eliminate that with folic acid. The other is B12. And B12, cyanocobalamin, is something that some folks have problems with because they don't make something called intrinsic factor, and others, they just don't absorb it as well. And both of those cause anemias from a lack of maturation. So we call them macrocytic anemias. The cell is too big. And I'll show you in lab what are called the indices so you can see how we evaluate what they are. I was treated for B12 deficiency because of that. Whether I got that from stomach surgeries or whether that's just something I had, don't know. You can supplement it. It's harder for folks who are vegan because they have to find special sources of B12. B12 is, most of the time you get B12 supplements animal based. You know, a lot, someone who's strict and vegan won't utilize that. So as I said to you before, they don't last that long. 90 to 120 is the range I've seen in a variety of texts and articles. So when you're donating blood, okay, it's probably the over-under is about 6 months without them using it that are there. And for those of you who donated blood, once you're on their list, they never forget about you. You're their best friend. They want you. Did you see that they had that plasma donation center that somebody rammed into? Now they're getting somebody on like vehicular homicide down by, it's like by the North Shore, by the stadium. It's like a plasma donation center. That happened a while ago. Down there, it's like we're 65 and down by like CCAC in that area. So it's like where you would park if you're going to Heinz Field or right around there. So red blood cells are anucleate, so they're not growing or dividing. They deteriorate. Hemoglobin deteriorates. They get trapped. And this is really job one and two of the spleen. Okay, because the spleen plays a role in immunology, certainly, and the spleen plays a pivotal role as a filter for the blood. So we overactive spleens can lead to anemia. There's splenic problems. The spleen is very interesting. It's very subject. It's an unusual organ that's non-essential because the liver can take over for it. And a spleen is something that famously is subject to blunt trauma. So one of the things you have to look for if you're going to go into a field where you're going to encounter people who are in accidents or in sport, when in the old days when a football player got hit, got a helmet in the gut, he had the wind knocked out of him. Well, understand that in modern days you have to be a lot more careful, and no less than one of the most significant commentators, if you're like me and a football addict, named Chris Sims. Phil Sims' dad, and Chris was a good quarterback for Tampa, not great. His dad's a better quarterback. But his career ended with blunt trauma to the abdomen. They didn't know he had a ruptured spleen, nearly died. And of course, Ryan Clark, that was sickle cell related. Okay, so that's another, and so again, destructive processes and fragmenting leads us to that, and so that's one of the roles. But you can do without a spleen. I had a lot of patients post-Vietnam who had, because of abdominal wounds, had to have spleens removed that were there. Because I treated a lot of folks who were my age who had been Vietnam era vets that were there. So heme, iron, and globin are separated. Okay, iron can be reutilized. The heme is the problem. Okay? The heme eventually forms bilirubin. The liver, and let me go back here to give you this before we go into this sort of transitional stuff that's here. It's hard to read. The liver, part of its job is to excrete in the form of bile, the bilirubin, and bile is other stuff. And it's degraded into urobilinogen, which colors the urine, and stercobilin, that colors the feces. The globin, like any other group of polypeptides, you can recycle, if you want to think of it that way. So you can see what goes on here. So here's the erythropoietin nugget, the bone marrow. Okay, so hemoglobin. So you have the heme becoming bilirubin, being excreted either through the gut or indirectly into the urine, the iron being bound back to the circulation, etc. So they're kind of giving you the idea of the red blood cells. So red blood cells move around. We make a ton of them, and we utilize a ton of them, and they have a limited lifespan. And they're just going through all these things that are there, and I'm not going to go through it. This is the nugget about anemia that I think is really very important. Okay. Anemia or polycythemia. Anemia, not enough. Poly, for many, too many that are there. The polycythemias are comparatively rare, except for one, which is based on respiratory. People with emphysema or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or other lung disorders cannot sufficiently oxygenate. It's a vicious cycle. They can't, their lungs don't work terribly well, usually from smoking. They can't basically oxygenate the blood rapidly enough. And what happens, the body doesn't know the reason. All it knows is I'm going to make more red blood cells. That makes the blood thicker. That makes the heart work harder. The heart is pushing against a clogged lung. So it puts an overstress on the heart. And at the same time, then the heart doesn't work as efficiently and the lung still isn't oxygenating the blood. And as it gets thicker and eventually is doomed to failure, whether the heart fails, whether there's a blood clot, whatever. That's what we refer to as secondary polycythemia. There's another one called polycythemia vera for true, or primary polycythemia. That's typically tumorous in nature, or other it's completely unknown causes that lead to that type of thing. So those are a little less frequent. We see a certain amount of normal polycythemia as you adapt to being at altitude. So if you took my daughter-in-law, my stepdaughter's, levels compared, if we had a record of what they were like when she lived here for all these years, and now, as an adult, and she's been up there for, 4 or 5 years, I'm sure those levels have gone up proportionally, just becoming acclimated to being at altitude. And any altitude would be greater in another city depending on where they are. Whether it's Mexico City, which is quite a bit higher, or Salt Lake City, which is a little bit higher. Versus anemias, abnormally low oxygen carrying capacity, too low. It is, and I agree completely, it's the sign of a problem rather than the problem. The whole idea with a workup or evaluation for anemia is what's causing it? Where does it come from? And so you can be very, very elaborate with these. Even if you're dealing with clotting in the same way, there's a lot more than the blood test that you'll see when I show you a typical CBC. You will, or the typical blood count that's done in all the indices and things. There's a whole lot of chemistries that are involved and sophisticated testing to determine. So we're looking at iron binding capacity and total iron and other factors that try to ascertain. Now, it's a challenging workup. So the doctors who do this are typically certified in what, so when you hear about, I'm going to a cancer specialist, those are called oncologists. Their certification is oncology and hematology. So their certification is in both that are there. So that's, like I said, the smart doctors right now. So that is too low to support normal metabolism, fatigue, pallor, difficulty breathing, being cold all the time. And number one on the hit parade, fatigue. I mean, I couldn't, walking without holding onto the shopping cart, I couldn't go from where I'd parked my car, taking like little baby steps. And at that point, I'm a 47-year-old guy. So I'm just trying to give you some context of how exhausting, how difficult it was breathing it was. Blood loss, kind of where mine was. And obviously, either you're not making enough or you're destroying too many. So it's pretty straightforward. Is something causing you to lose blood, either acutely or chronically? Is there a problem on the production line? Or is there some other factor involved that's causing destruction? So the blood loss, hemorrhagic, rapid from a wound, blood replacement. That's why we utilize typically whole blood for immediate blood replacement in times of major trauma versus what I had, chronic hemorrhagic. As you can see, hemorrhoids not, bleeding ulcer, yes. Slight but persistent blood loss. And the only way that eventually they stopped that is I had to have yet another major stomach surgery. It's okay. I don't get ulcers anymore. I like to give them. Right? Better to give than receive. Right? Never too early. Naughty or nice. And we know where you're falling. Okay. So if we're not making enough, iron deficiency anemia, hemorrhagic, and I basically had an offshoot of that. Low iron intake or problems with absorption. Okay. These are referred to as, and this is another characterization for anemias. We look, even on the peripheral smear microscopically, we look to see whether they have normal color or they're pale. Are they large or are they small? So you have microcytic, you don't have enough iron or the materials to make iron, they are small and they are pale. Versus if it's a problem with assembly, like the B12 I was telling you about, where they're not maturing, they tend to be large. Yes.
For iron deficiency anemia, is it like appropriate for people to take folic acid and vitamin B12 complex like
For sure.
vitamins as well, in addition to like an iron ferritin
Yeah,
supplement?
I think it's probably okay. I think the trouble I find with iron is taking the right one. Some irons are a little bit tough to tolerate. The one I take is called glycinate rather than sulfate. Sulfate tend to have more digestive problems. The only way to find, I mean, if you're taking one, it probably doesn't hurt whenever you get a physical or a checkup to ask for a blood iron level. Yeah. That type of thing. So I mean, I get one of those Nature's Remedy or whatever those are, things that I
Don't
buy.
get the gummy ones.
But
Don't
no, mine are capsules.
That one tastes like you're chewing a blood clot.
I remember that.
Well, can't they, like, if you take iron supplements for a certain amount of time, does it like do something to your esophagus?
I think in general, so again, it depends on how the iron is precipitated. For years, the sulfate was more problems gastrointestinally than gluconates or glycinates, which they used to do. Yes.
There are a lot of people though, like if they're anemic and they need to get like increased levels of iron, then they use like cast iron skillets. Doesn't that help as well?
I
Or is
don't
that
know.
just like a myth?
I don't know if that's a
I
myth or
actually
not.
just saw that on TikTok yesterday.
Really, I have no clue. 'Cause my
Yeah,
mom,
we cook with cast iron most of the
my
time.
mom like gets like IV sometimes to get rehydrated because her body doesn't cycle hydrates like that well. And the nurse was telling her that a lot of
Yeah,
people
no, a bunch of people are
do
lying.
that, where they eat off they cook with cast iron to increase iron levels in their diet.
I love cast iron.
Oh, that's the best. There's some avocado oil on that.
Oh yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Happy
It's
days.
like rich.
What?
No, I only use it for steaks. I only use avocado oil.
I beg your pardon. Well, we
make.
make.
There's a high smoke point.
Oh, help me, Lord! Finally I have people. So small and pale, cannot synthesize hemoglobin. They don't have the ingredients. Iron supplements. This is kind of the one I was dealing with a little bit. A variation on pernicious. Typically, it's autoimmune that destroys the intrinsic factor that is produced, and we will go over that. You might remember they're called parietal cells. We have to have that for B12 to be able to absorb B12 in our gut. You can supplement B12, okay, with injections directly or a nasal gel, okay, and that's the macrocytic anemia. So, and the same, and constantly, folks on dialysis or with really poor kidney function, they tend to be anemic. And we do make what's called Procrit. It's made genetically, and it probably has different names now, but the original one was Procrit. I had a lot of diabetic patients take that because they were anemic. And maybe one more. aplastic anemia. Very interesting. Years ago, we were using an antibiotic that was very powerful and very useful, broad spectrum, called chloramphenicol. And orally, a lot of people started to die from it because it was killing their bone marrow. And the research suggested it was not intravenous, but because of all the bad publicity, basically, other than being used topically, it has effectively disappeared. There are certain, not just radiation or viruses, but aplastic anemia can come as a side effect to certain medications, exposure to chemicals. It's not clear the mechanism. It's aplastic in the sense that nothing is made. Because we have 1,000 times more red cells than white cells, the usual people succumb to infection because they don't have enough white cells to fight infection. So, and again, probably these days you're looking at bone marrow transplants. So we'll stop there before we get to the hemolytic anemias. That's where sickle cell and the thalassemias come into play.